Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Gen Z for Green Deal podcast episode by Projects in Motion Limited in Malta. The Gen Z for Green Deal Erasmus Plus project aims to develop a training and capacity building program for young people to actively participate in the development of their local community and environment and encourage young people to think more actively about sustainable development, environmental protection, and other green topics. My name is Stefan, and today I will be talking again to Dr. Brian Restall. For those of you who have just tuned in, Brian is a sustainability expert working for the local NGO Malta Regional Development and Dialogue Foundation. Brian, in the last episode we spoke about the barriers to sustainable development and explained some key necessities to overcome these. Today we will give our listeners some insights into the issue of social acceptance and how it can affect effective sustainable development. Brian, what does social acceptance mean in the context of sustainable development?
Thanks for having me again in this podcast, Steph. Okay, so social acceptance. This is a very important issue faced by most sustainability projects all over the world, I would say, and more often than not, it's one of the major reasons why greening projects, for instance, fail at the implementation level, typically because there is lack of social acceptance. Let's say that social acceptance in the context of sustainable development refers to the level of public support for and acceptance of a sustainability project. Let me give you some examples, typical examples of projects that require social acceptance, and these would be, for instance, battery plants, wind farms, or solar parks that often create conflict within communities. I would say that social acceptance is indeed an essential requirement in order to avoid negative attitudes from the general public, even public officials involved and business operators in the area. So it's important to really evaluate the readiness of the public in embracing, for instance, renewables or sustainable development investments in their area, because it could backfire if they don't accept the necessity of these projects. Also, typically, you can try and measure the degree of social acceptance, if you like, and that was typically reflected in the trust of government and business operators, the perceived risks or the benefits, the necessity and the fairness of those proposals in the eyes of stakeholders. So social acceptance is not easy to achieve, but is critical to most projects. Having said that, social acceptance itself is also split further into other areas like socio-political acceptance, community acceptance, and market acceptance. I find that these three are very distinguishable within social acceptance theory.
Can you explain in more detail what these three dimensions of social acceptance are?
Yes, certainly. As I mentioned, we're looking at typically three sub-dimensions of social acceptance. Let me start with the first one, socio-political acceptance, which typically refers to social acceptance on the broadest level by key stakeholders and most policy actors. You could say that several indicators demonstrate that public acceptance for sustainable initiatives and policies is high in most member states. However, this could also easily mislead policymakers to believe that social acceptance is not an issue at the local level, whereas in fact it indeed is a major problem. And that leads us to community acceptance, a second dimension, which refers specifically to the acceptance of sustainable projects by the actual local stakeholders, particularly residents and local authorities. This is where many suggest that people typically reject projects when they are in their own backyard. You have a lot of psychosocial factors coming into play, the NIMBY syndrome, the fear of uncertainty, fear of change, And typical factors that seem to influence community acceptance are related to their perception of distributional justice, which typically means how are costs and benefits shared. The procedural justice is there a fair decision-making process, giving all relevant stakeholders an opportunity to participate? Was the procedure fair? And whether the local communities trust the information and intentions of the investors or actors or government players from outside the community. So community acceptance is a bit more focused on the affected locality. We cannot exclude market acceptance either in this discussion, because that deals specifically with relationships between investors and consumers. It refers to market adoption of an innovation by various stakeholders, including consumers. I'll give you an example. The diffusion of heat pumps for energy generation at home, from a market perspective, includes acceptance by those developing and providing the technology, those actually offering the service to install it, and on the demand side, those using the energy generated at home. So there needs to be an acceptance by all players in the market for a project to sort of see the light of day.
Brian, are there any other challenges that have a bearing on social acceptance of sustainability projects?
Yes, for sure. And another challenge is ensuring equitable representation of stakeholders and making sure that underrepresented groups in sustainable development projects and their priorities are simply not ignored. Similarly, one also needs to be aware that issues that have high representation or voting turnouts tend to be addressed more quickly than other lower vote grabbing issues. So minorities are typically underrepresented. Related challenges also offered by the fact that not everyone is equally aware and educated on sustainability issues at hand, for instance. So while today's citizens have more access to information thanks to digital tools, not everyone is digitally competent enough to partake and participate in certain groupings.
Thank you very much, Brian, for these valuable insights, and I'm happy that we will have the opportunity to talk about stakeholders and how they can be involved in a meaningful way in sustainability projects in the next podcast episode. That brings us to the end of the second episode about social acceptance of sustainable community projects. Thank you again for joining us today, and stay tuned for the next episode. Until next time, take care.